I used to live in Guam. I lived in Guam for 2.5 years, and I loved it in Guam. And some of you may be wondering, where in the world is Guam? And so I was like, well, I know this is a little hard to see, but here's of course, here's the United States. We've got Australia over here. Here's Japan. You can't really see it on there, but that's Hawaii right there. Guam is right in this area right here. It's an 8-hour flight from Hawaii, an 8-hour flight from Australia, just about 4 hours from Japan. So I'm going to zoom, we'll zoom in here and take a look at the lovely island of Guam. It's 30 miles long, anywhere from 4 to 8 miles wide, depending on where you are on the island. The temperature there is the same year-round. It only changes really by, the average temperature is really only changed by a couple of degrees for a couple months a year. Basically, it's the same year-round. The temperature is in the upper 80s, between 85 and you have a high of about 90 year-round. And at nighttime, it'll drop a little bit. It'll get down in the lower 80s, maybe the upper 70s. It's pretty humid, about like Georgia, maybe a little bit worse. But you've got that nice breeze coming in off the ocean. Nobody even really carries an umbrella in Guam because the rain showers are so short that you'll get drenched, and then the storm will blow on by, and then 5 minutes later you're dry again because it's all that water that you just collected evaporates. So nobody even carries umbrellas. But island life isn't for everyone. Some people on Guam got what they called island fever. And island fever is when you can't deal with being on a small island for an extended period of time. And some people just couldn't take that. They just felt a little bit cramped. One of the things that takes a while to get used to living on Guam or another island is what they call island time. Island time means we'll get to it when we get to it. No one's in a hurry. Something that could be done now could be done just as easily 4 hours from now. There's no real rush. And maybe that's why I liked Guam so much. I have this tendency towards procrastination, and that tendency fits right in when you're on island time. Let's switch back to civilization here, if we can. You know, the hippie movement of the 1960s also tended to not be very concerned with time. You may remember the Chicago Transit Authority. Their hit song from 1969 started off like this. And let's see, it went something like this. As I was walking down the street one day, a man came up to me and asked me what the time was that was on my watch. Yeah. And I said, and it's supposed to. Horns. I love those horns. Does anybody really care what time it is? Or excuse me, does anybody really know what time it is? Does anybody even really care? Well, we're not living in the hippie movement, and we're not living on island time. In fact, we live in a culture that is obsessed with time. It seems everything runs on a schedule. As we go through each day, we have to be at a certain place at a certain time. Our lives tend to revolve around schedules and appointments. We even schedule storms into our lives. Have you noticed that? Meteorologists are constantly watching weather patterns. And when a hurricane begins to form out in the ocean, they'll calculate the path of that storm and see if it's going to hit land somewhere. And they'll determine when and where the storm will hit so that we can make appropriate plans and take action. If the weatherman calls for a half-inch of snow, all the bread and milk in North Georgia will disappear off the grocery store shelves. Because we don't want to be caught in a storm unprepared. We care about these things. Even when thunderstorms pop up during the summer, we can look at an app on our phones and follow the storm cells on radar. And we can sometimes know down to a few minutes of when it will start raining by interpreting the appearance of the sky. And yet, Jesus told the crowds that although they could interpret the appearance of the earth and sky, they couldn't interpret this time. The Greek word Jesus uses there for time is kairos. He wasn't talking about the time of day or anyone's schedule. That would have been chronos. That's where we get the word chronometer. No, Jesus was referring to a season of time. A storm is coming. That's what Jesus tells us in this text. A storm is coming. And in the midst of the storm, there will be division. You remember a few weeks ago when we said that Jesus came to bring justice or judgment to the world. That is what Jesus meant in verse 49 when he said, I came to bring fire on the earth, and how I wish it were already set ablaze. Jesus is looking forward to the day when people who will trust in and rely on the Son will be restored to the Father. He's looking forward to the day when the sin of those who surrender to him will be washed away. He's talking about the fire of judgment. And just like judgment, fire is both good and bad. The fire Jesus is talking about both refines what is good and consumes what is bad. Jesus looks forward to the day when evil will be separated from good. We often think about this as final judgment, but that is not really what Jesus is talking about here. In this passage, Jesus tells us that division will happen on the earth. And he tells us that he came to bring that division. But it was not yet time for that. Something had to happen first. In verse 50, Jesus said, but I have a baptism to be baptized with, and how it consumes me until it is finished. The baptism here that Jesus is referring to is the baptism of his suffering, death, and resurrection. That is the event that would cause this division that he is warning us of. Darkness cannot fellowship with light. Those who surrender their lives to Jesus can no longer hang out with the people they used to hang out with. You guys know this. When you've been transformed by Jesus, you can't do the things that you used to do. In fact, you no longer want to do those things. And so while Jesus brings reconciliation to the kingdom of heaven, he brings division to the earth. That's what he tells us here in verse 51. Do you think that I came here to give peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. Some people seem to think Jesus is in the storm prevention business. They see Jesus as someone who brings peace and tranquility to all people. I guess in a sense they see the cross as a happily ever after kind of story. But Jesus didn't come to stop the storm. He came to carry us through it. Our responsibility is to know what time it is. Our responsibility is to recognize the time and take action. Too often we build our schedules around those things we can see with our eyes. But when it comes to the kingdom of God, we're living on island time. We'll get to it when we get to it. The problem is the storm is already upon us. The time for action is now. There's a story which has been widely publicized, so there's a good chance that you guys have already heard it. However, it's a good story, so I'm going to read it for you anyway. A terrible storm came into a town, and local officials sent out an emergency warning that the riverbanks would soon overflow and flood the nearby homes. They ordered everyone in the town to evacuate immediately. A faithful Christian man heard the warning and decided to stay, saying to himself, "I will trust God, and if I'm in danger, then God will send a divine miracle to save me." The neighbors came by his house and said to him, "We're leaving, and there's room for you in our car. Please come with us." But the man declined. Instead, he said, "I have faith that God will save me." As the man stood on his porch watching the water rise up the steps, a man in a canoe paddled by his house. And he called to him and he said, "Hurry, come into my canoe. The waters are rising quickly." But the man again said, "No thanks. God will save me." The flood waters rose higher, pouring water into his living room, and the man had to retreat to the second floor. A police motorboat came by and saw him at the window. "We will come and rescue you," they shouted. But the man refused, waving them off. He said, "Use your time to save someone else. I have faith that God will save me." The floodwaters rose higher and higher, and the man had to climb up on his rooftop. A helicopter spotted him and dropped a rope ladder. A rescue officer came down the ladder and pleaded with the man, "Grab my hand and I will pull you up." But the man still refused. Folding his arms tightly to his body, he said, "No, thank you. God will save me." Shortly after, his house broke up and the floodwaters swept the man away and he drowned. When he got to heaven, the man stood before God and asked, "I put all my faith in you. Why didn't you come and save me?" And God said, "Son, I sent you a warning. I sent you a car. I sent you a canoe. I sent you a motorboat. And I sent you a helicopter. What more were you looking for?" Jesus didn't come to stop the storm. He came to carry us through it. But we still have to act. We need to know what time it is. A storm is coming, and it's already upon us. That is what Jesus is warning us about in this text. Jesus doesn't warn the crowd so that they will worry about the storm. He warns them a storm is coming so that they can watch for it and be ready. The man in our story was not prepared to act. He thought he could just ride through life and God would pluck him out of danger. Jesus will carry us through the storm. He's just waiting for us to take that first step. As a church, you have taken that step. We are in the midst of a storm, but Jesus will carry us through. He will carry us through. What we need to do now is keep an eye on the weather and trust Jesus. He might send a car. He might send a canoe. He might send a motorboat. He might even send a helicopter. But he will definitely make a way to carry us through the storm. I just want to invite you today into a time of community prayer. I know this is a little different. We've changed our order of worship a little bit. We're going to have a time of community prayer, and if there's something on your heart that you'd like to pray about, you're welcome to speak up. We'll have a time of silence and you can pray what's on your heart. What storms are you going through today? Have you seen Jesus in them?